Saw it in the 19th century, with the rise of the United States, of Germany, and Japan. What's so different? What's new? And at the very least, we have to ask that question and to address that question. And then the final reason why just looking and claiming that an international relations from the South is inadequate is because of the power of the global. The great stories about how the logics of a globalized world are changing the world, the dominant ones all grew out of Europe in the 19th century. The Marxist story, the powerful imagery and language, particularly of Marx the journalist, rather than Marx the theoretician, about the power of capitalism, breaking down, refashioning societies across the world. The liberal story about how modernization, globalization as it became in the 19th century, was changing the face of all human societies. The political story, the geopolitical story. So we have Marx, we have Mill, we also have Mackinder, Alfred Mackinder, the great geopolitician. His writing at the turn of the 20th century, describing how, as he puts it, for the first time in human history, the clash of political forces is now happening on a global stage. Each of those stories, Marx, Mill, Mackinder, claims that they are analysing logics which all societies, as histories move forward, will have to confront and will become inevitably involved in. Wherever they are across the world, whatever their historical, religious, civilizational background, the global cannot be evaded or avoided. Now, Lyotard, post-structuralists tell us the whole time that we should be suspicious of these great meta-narratives, and with good reason. Meta-narratives are always difficult and potentially dangerous things. But on the other hand, we can't avoid meta-narratives. We can't avoid big pictures about the way the world is going. And in particular, if we want to understand emerging powers, we have to ask not just how they see the world differently, how their own traditions may be reflected in what they do and what they say, but how these three great forces, the Marxist, the liberal, and the geopolitical, are pulling them together, pushing them apart, how they're impacting on those societies. But still we have the question, what do we do? What does it mean? What can the study of international relations actually do to understand these things? Well, I'm going to start here. Actually, not with the theoretical, but with the individual. What is it to be an academic, to be an intellectual, trying to make sense of this changing world? And we think about intellectuals, maybe wrongly, I think at least I do, primarily in terms of opening up ideas, making people think about problems, perhaps making people think about problems in different ways. Often the insights come from distance, from critical distance. Think of some of the great intellectuals who shape the way we think about the world. I know many people here, several, have been reading the new biography of Albert Fischler, a quintessential example of somebody who navigated from Berlin to the US to South America, and whose insights come from having geographic, cultural, critical distance. Edward Said tells us the intellectual is about the person who speaks truth to power. All fine, easy to say, hard to do. There are many temptations to everybody. Devish Kapoor, who runs the Center for Indian Studies in Pennsylvania, had a wonderful article in the Financial Times where he said academics have more to declare than their genius. And what he was pointing to was the corruption of economics as an academic profession in the United States and in the West in the lead up to the financial crisis, when the temptations of money, the temptations of academic success had precluded, had avoided people taking a critical distance on what was happening in the world. And here, in many parts of the emerging world, the problems, if anything, are more intense. Well, why are they? Well, first of all, because there is an obvious kind of need to say, well, academics should be producing knowledge that is relevant to policy. After all, that's why we're paying them, that's why we have university. If you want to solve problems that are facing our societies. In many countries, the study of international relations is closely connected to government. Brazil is like the paradigmatic case, where Itamaraty, the foreign ministry, has exercised a colossal influence over how people think about international relations. In some ways good, but in some ways a problem. How do you separate out the practice of international relations from the analysis of international relations? And of course there's money in what governments want. There's a lot of money in BRICS. If BRICS are what governments want to study, then the temptation for academics to study BRICS is very big. But that of course brings problems. Problems about who is setting the agenda. Now, again, this is not easy. One might, for example, agree politically or normatively that a multipolar world is better, and therefore support the promotion of BRICS, the promotion of all that's involved in that way of thinking. As I said before, from a government's perspective, the idea of a Chinese view of international relations, an Indian view of international relations, makes a great deal of political sense. But it still raises the question for the academic, what's my position vis-à-vis what is changing politically? If all I am doing is repeating what foreign ministries say, what governments say, then is that really what academics are in the business of doing? Surely we might want to use what governments say to explain better, to propose a more consistent normative project, maybe to show how particular things fit into a bigger pattern. But whatever it is, it's something different to what governments are doing and often wanting. So still we have the question, what do we do? Yes, we want to be critical, what does that mean? Let's look a little bit more in terms of theories, and particularly critical theories. As most people know, probably more than in many other social sciences, the dominant, particularly North American, but Atlantic mainstream, is dominated by a kind of rationalist positivism, a view of politics as being driven by ideas of interest, ideas of power, ideas of strategic choice. This is how we make sense of what governments do, individuals do, foreign policies are all about. These logics of power, these logics of strategic choice are essentially the same everywhere. We don't really need to know that much about different bits of the world because our way of thinking helps us understand what is happening in many different places. Now against that, of course, we have, as I'll say in more detail in a moment, a whole range of critical, constructivist voices saying, well, that's not enough, that's hopeless. We need to know much more about identities, the variation of concepts, about the role of historical, cultural, civilizational trajectories and knowledge in understanding why individuals, groups, states act in the way they do. And as I say, I think that's very important, and I'll come back to it. But going down that road can still be dangerous. Let me give an example. The study of ASEAN in Southeast Asia. A big study, lots of people arguing, well, to understand ASEAN, you can't look at Europe. You can't think about European-style institutions. You have to understand the ASEAN way, much more a product of a particular regional, cultural background. Different sets of norms that explain what regional institutions are, built much more on consultation, discourse, on language, on norms, than on formal institutions. Fine, very important, very interesting. But often, those accounts, that image, that picture, ends up being very, very, very close to what elites and what governments are saying. There's very little critical distance between what ASEAN elites say and many scholars of that kind say. The rise in China after 2005 of the discussion of a harmonious world and alternative conceptions of a harmonious world. Again, maybe less surprisingly in that case, the links between academy and politics are very close. Here in Brazil, the politicization of foreign policy, the attempt on many people's part, in a sense, to see and to argue about international relations very much from the perspective of domestic politics, with there being a very clear official line about what Brazil does in the world. Now that may be very good for citizens, it may be very good for politics, for parties, but it's very, very bad for the academic analysis of Brazilian foreign policy. It either produces conformity, everyone saying the same, repeating whatever governments say, or it produces polarization. Political polarization, not intellectual polarization, which is good. So we're still left with, well, what can we do to be more critical? Get more distance. This is what I want to look at in the last part of what I have to say. And my first point here is to say that what counts as being critical depends on where you are. There's no kind of magic answer to that. And I think, in many parts of the emerging world, actually being critical can precisely mean using some of the tools of orthodox, mainstream Western social science. Think about emerging powers. Let's turn down the volume. Let's not listen to what they say about why they're different, why they're exceptional. Just look at what they do. What they want depends on where they are in the power hierarchy. Brazil, every foreign minister says, loves institutions, loves multilateralism. Well, it doesn't.